Hello and welcome back to my F1 retrospective series. In the last episode, we went over how F1 wasn't actually being run to F1 rules, but rather F2 rules in a bid to increase the grid size and allow for more competition. The result being that Alberto Ascari and Ferrari ran off and won one of the most dominant titles in history. So that backfired. But apparently the FIA didn't believe in lightning striking twice, as for 1953 the championship would once again be run to Formula 2 regulations, although the circumstances of this season would at least be somewhat different. Maserati was actually here properly from the get-go, and what's more, they had Fangio on their side. On top of this, the season was longer, 8 races excluding the Indy 500, and the new race added to the calendar would be in Fangio's homeland. Surely things would go different this time, right? Four teams turned up for the first round in Argentina at the newly completed track near Buenos Aires, built under the orders of President Juan Perón. After all, the country had produced not just one, but two F1 superstars, and they were national heroes, so why wouldn't you want F1 to come to you? Maserati fielded a team of four, three of them being Argentinian. These were Fangio, Gonzalez, and another man named Oscar Alfredo Galvez. These three were alongside the Italian Felice Bonotto. An interesting fact here is that Oscar was racing at a track that would one day be named after him, as the track was renamed after him and his brother Juan once President Perón was overthrown. Cooper were also in attendance, however they had lost their talismanic lead driver in Mike Hawthorne. Gordini were at the event as well, having retained their principal trio of Manson, Beira and Trintignant, driving alongside a pair of local drivers. Meanwhile, reigning champions Ferrari, like Maserati, fielded a team of four cars. These belonged to the defending champion Ascari, 1950 champion Farina, and the experienced Ferrari driver Vioresi, as well as the new recruit, Mike Hawthorne, whose Herculean efforts in subpar machinery the year before had clearly caught the attention of the old man back at Maranello. In qualifying, Ascari started off his title defence in the best way possible, beating the closest rival of Fangio to pole position by 7/10 of a second. Behind those two, Vioresi was third, followed by Farina, Gonzalez and Hawthorne. The Gordinis were drowning in the mid-pack. On race day, Ascari led Fangio off the line, and it stayed that way for the beginning stages of the race. However, this race would be remembered for other reasons. On lap 31, tragedy struck. See, in order to get as many people to see the race as possible, President Perón had granted free access to the facility. There were so many that they were literally lining the track as the race began. One of the spectators wandered onto the track, right into the path of Farina's Ferrari. Farina reacted quickly to avoid hitting them, however in doing so he lost control of the car and crashed. He ploughed into the crowd, killing 13 spectators. This caused a mass panic, during which a boy ran out into the front of Alan Brown's Cooper. That boy was also killed. And yet, in a display of just how little safety was cared about back then, the race continued as normal, even as the bodies were lining the side of the track. Ascari would go on to win the race and take fastest lap, completing a Grand Slam. Fangio would have been second, but shortly after Farina's accident, his gearbox broke. Vioresi would inherit second place, and Gonzalez would complete the podium. Mike Hawthorne marked his Ferrari debut with good fourth place, and overall debutant Galvez finished fifth. Although, as I mentioned before, this race would be remembered for much more tragic reasons. The next race at Zandvoort wasn't going to take place for another 5 months. Till then, with no racing as a distraction, this event would hang over the championship like a black cloud. Arguably, it still hangs over the Argentinian circuit to this day. As the paddock arrived in the Netherlands for the second round of the championship, the main two teams in Ferrari and Maserati were mostly the same, the only difference between Argentina and here being the Maserati of Galvez being absent. In qualifying, Ascari took another pole position, once again beating Fangio in second, this time by 1.6 seconds. Christ. The top six would be completed by Farina, Vioresi, Gonzalez and Hawthorne. On race day, the conditions on track were difficult, with the track being made slippery by loose grit. The Ferraris, having much better traction than the Ferraris, sped off into the distance, with Ascari ahead of Farina and Vioresi. On lap 22, Gonzalez's axle broke, putting him out of the race. However, this was in an era of shared drives being legal, so a few laps later, teammate Bonotto was ordered into the pits to hand over his car, and he obliged, and Gonzalez was back in the race. On lap 36, Fangio's axle broke as well, and there was no other car for him to get into. He was out. This wasn't good. If he wanted to challenge Ascari, he needed to actually start finishing races. The race would also be over for another big name. As on lap 67, Vioresi's Ferrari had developed a throttle problem. This would leave third place to be fought over by Mike Hawthorne and a resurgent Gonzalez. This thrilling battle would ultimately be won by Gonzalez, as he once again denied Ferrari a podium lockout. The final points-paying position went to Tuolo de Graffenried in a privately entered Maserati. This meant that Ascari now led his closest rival, which was his teammate Vioresi, by 10 points with only 2 rounds completed. Maserati were being absolutely trounced. The paddock arrived in Spa, and the record crowd of 100,000 spectators were going to be in for a show because, joy of joys, Maserati had the pace to match Ferrari in qualifying, as Fangio was the one to beat Ascari to the pole with an absolutely blistering lap speed of 117 miles an hour, shattering the previous record. Gonzalez made it 2 Maseratis in the top 3, and the top 6 was completed by Farina, Vioresi, and the third Maserati being driven by Argentina's Onofre Marimon. On race day, Maserati appeared to have kept their qualifying pace, as at the flag, Gonzalez jumped Ascari and then was waved past by teammate Fangio into the lead. Gonzalez then stunned everyone by setting an average lap speed of 110 miles an hour from a standing start. The Maseratis were blisteringly fast, as by lap 10, Gonzalez led Fangio by a full minute. However, the next lap, Gonzalez's engine expired, his pace clearly having taken its toll. This left Fangio in the lead by 30 seconds ahead of Ascari. However, just 2 laps after his teammate, it was Fangio's turn to experience an engine failure. This meant that Ascari inherited the lead ahead of Farina, Hawthorne, Marimon and Vioresi. The next lap, the Maserati of Johnny Claes, then running in 9th, was handed over to Fangio, who began to charge back through the field, helped by Farina's engine expiring on lap 16. Hawthorne would then drop back with a fuel leak, handing second to Vioresi, who had managed to overtake Marimon. Marimon would then be passed by a charging Fangio. So Ascari would win, followed by Vioresi, and it looked like Fangio would finish third. However, on the last lap of the race, he crashed heavily, handing third to Marimon. The remaining points would be taken by Tuolo de Graffenried and Maurice Trintignant. A third non-finish in a row meant that Ascari's would-be rival was nowhere, while Ascari himself led the standings by 12 points ahead of second-place Vioresi. Instead, it was Gonzalez that was holding up Maserati's honour, while Farina dropped down to 5th. Arriving in France for the 4th round of the championship at Reims, it looked as though Ascari already had one hand on the trophy, as he'd won all 3 races so far, whereas his would-be rival in Fangio had yet to even finish a single one. This wasn't due to subpar machinery as such, it was more just a case of bad luck. Unlike in 1952, where the Ferrari was simply in a class of its own, the Ferraris and Maseratis of 1953 were quite evenly matched, both excelling in different areas. The Maseratis had more power and thus more straight-line speed, but had shown themselves to be fragile. The Ferraris, meanwhile, lacking power, made up for it by having better brakes and generally a better handling platform. And given the layout of the French Grand Prix circuit seemingly to heavily favour the Maseratis, you wouldn't be blamed for thinking they would run well here. Well, if they didn't break down again. In qualifying, the top 6 were separated by just 1.3 seconds. It was an Italian 1-2-3, with Ascari on pole, then the Maserati of Bonetto in second, and Ferrari of Vioresi in third. 4th and 5th were occupied by Fangio and Gonzalez, respectively, while Farina was 6th and Hawthorne was down in 7th. Although Ferrari almost didn't start the race at all. The day before, there was a sporting 12-hour sports car race that ran from midnight to midday. During the race, the leading Ferrari was disqualified on the grounds of receiving a push start and also for turning off their headlights too early. However, Ferrari protested by saying that the push start was necessary to avoid spilt petrol in the pit lane, and that several other cars had turned off their headlights before them, yet suffered no punishment. Both the Ferrari team and the crowd were outraged, with the crowd throwing rubbish at the race officials, and Ferrari threatening to withdraw their cars from the F1 event in protest. However, a series of phone calls between Reims and Modena saw the situation resolved and Ferrari would in fact take the start. On race day, Gonzalez, unlike everybody else, opted to start the race with only half a tank of fuel. This would give him a boost off the line, but it also meant that he would have to make a pit stop, unlike everybody else who was running a full tank of fuel to last to the end of the race. And sure enough, at the start of the race he went from 5th to 1st, and by the end of the first lap he had pulled out a 2.8 second gap. Behind him it was Ascari, Vioresi, Bonetto, Fangio, Farina, Hawthorne, Marimon. Over the next few laps the order shifted, Gonzalez continued to pull away, while Ascari, Vioresi and Hawthorne disputed second place with Farina close behind. They were followed by Fangio and Marimon, with Bonetto having dropped to 9th after a spin. On lap 23, Fangio overtook Farina. The following lap, Farina repassed him, setting the fastest lap of the race in the process. Fangio then overtook Farina again the next lap, setting a new fastest lap. This upturn in pace from the pair of them meant they were now in the middle of the three squabbling Ferraris. Gonzalez would make his pit stop on lap 29, and he'd not pulled out the sufficient gap, and he would drop to 6th. At this point, Fangio led Hawthorn and Ascari, and now the battle would make this race famous was just beginning. From here until the flag, over the course of 30 laps, Hawthorn and Fangio would battle ferociously, almost constantly side by side, changing the lead almost every lap, sometimes multiple times a lap, reportedly swapping positions at almost every corner. And that wasn't the only titanic battle that was going on. Behind Hawthorn and Fangio, Ascari and Gonzalez were battling for third place. Both battles persisted until the end of the race, with the drivers rarely being separated by more than a car length at any one time. With 2 laps to go, Hawthorn and Fangio crossed the line side by side, followed about a second later by Ascari and Gonzalez, who were also side by side. Hawthorn led going into the final lap. Ascari had dropped back, but Gonzalez kept pushing, turning a 2-car battle for the win into a 3-car one. On the final straight, Gonzalez was closing, but the finish line came just too soon. Hawthorn would win his first ever Grand Prix, which would be known hereafter as the race of the century. Ahead of Fangio and then Gonzalez. Top 3 were separated by just less than 1.5 seconds. Ascari and Farina would finish 4th and 5th, respectively. In the championship standings, Hawthorn's win catapulted him up to 2nd place behind the dominant Ascari, who had doubled the points total of the Briton. Fioresi dropped to 3rd, while at least Fangio now has some points on the board. At Silverstone, the lineup for the main 2 teams remained unchanged, and in qualifying, Ascari put his Ferrari on pole, joined on the front row by the Maserati of Gonzalez and the Ferrari of new winner Mike Hawthorn. Fangio was down in 4th, with Farina and Fioresi in 5th and 6th, respectively. On race day, not much to talk about happened. Ascari would lead from start to finish, and take the flag first, 1 second ahead of Fangio, with Farina completed the podium. Gonzalez would finish 4th, and Hawthorn would finish 5th. The point for fastest lap would be split between Ascari and Gonzalez, at both drivers at identical times. In the championship standings, Fangio finally hauled himself into the top 5, although he'd be forgiven for fearing by this point it was already too late, as he was now over 20 points behind Ascari in first. Arriving at the Nürburgring, Ascari had a chance to clinch the title with 2 rounds to go, just as he had done the year before. The only way he could be stopped is if Fangio or Hawthorn won the race. Failure to do so would mean that Ascari would be champion regardless of where he finished. In qualifying, Ascari laid down the gauntlet and qualified on pole, the only driver to set a lap time under 10 minutes. Fangio still had a very good chance of victory though, starting from 2nd on the grid. Hawthorn's chances were less good as he was down in 4th. On race day, there was some good news for the challengers, as despite leading early on, Ascari would fall victim to car troubles and would not score any points, save for the fastest lap point. All the other 2 had to do was win, but they didn't. Instead, it was Farina who won, over a minute ahead of Fangio in 2nd, with Hawthorn in 3rd. Felice, Bonotto, and Tuolo de Graffenried would take the final points-paying positions. All this meant that Ascari, just like last year, had wrapped up the title at the Nürburgring, making him the first person in F1 history to defend a title, and also the first to win more than one title. 2nd place was still up for grabs though, as there was only 2 points between Farina, Fangio and Hawthorn, with 2 rounds still to go. Switzerland saw an addition to Maserati's lineup, with the one-off return of War racing great Hermann Lang. He would qualify 11th, while his teammate Fangio would put it on pole, with Ascari's just 6/10 of a second behind. Farina was 3rd, while Maurice Transjean put in a remarkable performance by putting his Gordini 4th on the grid, beating out Marimon, Hawthorn, Fioresi, despite being in a much inferior car. On race day, Ascari and Farina would engage in a battle for the lead. 12 laps in, Fangio and Bonotto would actually switch cars, however Fangio wouldn't go much further than half distance, owing to an engine failure. Bonotto would take Fangio's car to 4th place, behind a podium of Ascari, Farina and Hawthorn, meaning a podium lockout for the Scuderia. Perhaps even more remarkably, Hermann Lang managed to finish 5th. In the standings, with 1 round to go, Farina was in prime placement to finish runner-up behind a dominant Ascari. Meanwhile, 1.5 points still separated Fangio and Hawthorn. Going into the final race at Monza, Ferrari had won every single race. Maserati had not lived up to their expectations this year, but if they wanted something, anything, to show for their efforts, this was their last chance. Ascari would put his Ferrari on pole in front of a jubilant Tifosi, with Fangio and Farina alongside him on the front row. The next four positions would be occupied by, in this order, Marimon, Fioresi, Hawthorn, and Bonetto. On race day, the top four on the grid would engage in a spectacular early race battle for the lead. However, Marimon would eventually drop back. However, Ascari, Fangio, and Farina would continue their battle for the duration of the race. This lead would change hands a total of 19 times over 80 laps of racing, and it was the finish of the race that would go down in history. The leading three approached the final corner of the final lap side by side by side. However, going through the long curve of the Parabolica, Ascari made a rare mistake and spun out of the race, thereby proving that he was in fact a human being. In avoiding the spinning Ferrari, Farina swerved onto the grass but managed to wrestle the car back under control, but he lost ground. Fangio saw his chance and pounced to take a famous win ahead of Farina. The leading trio had been so fast that third place Fioresi was a lap down, as were the other point scorers Hawthorn and Trintignant. So at the end of the season, Ascari was champion, with a points margin of 6.5 points over Fangio, perhaps masking how dominant he truly was once again, because of course only certain results counted. Farina would finish third, however if you get rid of the stupid points rule, he would have actually beaten Fangio to second. Hawthorn would be fourth, and Fioresi would be fifth. Well, Maserati had failed to topple the monster that was the Ascari-Ferrari combination. However, next year, 1954, would be a year of change in two areas. F1 would finally be F1 again, ditching the F2 rules. But it would also be a year of newcomers. Reigning champion Ascari would leave Ferrari to join the arriving Lancia team. Meanwhile, another team would make its triumphant return to Grand Prix racing for the first time since the Second World War. A mark whose motorsport pedigree is almost unrivaled. One that I'm fairly certain even very recent F1 fans will be acutely aware of. Until next time.